dilemma and how he handled it. In order to understand how he handled the dilemma, we first have to look at the halacha side at the questionable action or practice that Yaakov took or participated in that makes us want to understand his thought process. So in this week's parsha, in the Torah portion, we read how Yaakov ran away from his hometown in Israel, in the land of Canaan, in order to get away from his brother Esav, who was trying to kill him. That's where he had his dream. He saw the ladder. He had the angels escorting him from the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, outside of the land of Israel. He arrives and he meets Rachel, and they vow to get married. And he works for 7 years in order to he works for his future father-in-law for 7 years. Now, Lavan had two daughters, Rachel and Leah, um, and Leah was the older one. So what happened was, let's take a look at what happened at the wedding, because in those days, if you didn't have a torch, you didn't always see the person clearly. So at the wedding, Leah was switched out for Rachel, and instead of Rachel being, under the canopy for the wedding, it was Leah. And Yaakov didn't recognize the fact that it's Leah and not Rachel. They were twins, just Leah was the older twin. Um, did not recognize that it was Leah until the morning. So what did Yaakov do? Yaakov went to Laban and said, "You tricked me, you deceived me." And that's where Laban responded that in our society, we don't let a younger girl get married before her older sister or whatever. So what happened? Yaakov worked another 7 years, and he married, and then eventually he married Rachel. The problem is, I'm just giving you the verbal background here, and we'll see it in the text. But the problem here is that according to the Torah, um, you are not allowed to marry two sisters. It says clearly in the Torah, in Leviticus, that we're not supposed to. We're going to see the text. So you're not supposed to marry two sisters, and there's reasons for it, but it's still a mitzvah that we're not allowed to do. Um, Now the Torah wasn't given yet. The Torah wasn't given until Mount Sinai, which was much later than this story of Yaakov. However, we are taught through the commentaries that Yaakov and the other patriarchs and matriarchs all kept the Torah even though it wasn't given yet. So if this conflicts with the Torah, how was Yaakov able to marry two sisters when it was clearly against the Torah, which he practiced? So let's take a look at some of the details in Rashi, and specifically how we come to the conclusion of how we understand this to learn our lesson. So after being deceived by his father-in-law, he eventually married Rachel. Rachel was his love of his, the one he loved. He did not divorce Leah though, so he ended up being married to both Rachel and Leah. And as we know, the 12 tribes of Israel came from both Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah, but we're not going to talk about that now. The 12 tribes of Israel were born through the marriage, mostly through Leah, but also through Rachel. So let's take a look. This is the in Vayikra, in Leviticus. This is where it tells us, you don't even have to go to the commentaries, but it tells us very clearly that you're not allowed to marry two sisters, and there's a rivalry because there could be a rivalry. And this is why it doesn't matter if it's a half sister or not sister. We can't marry two sisters no matter what. And that now that the Torah is given, this is a law that can never be challenged or broken. So what does Rashi say about us over here? First of all, how do we know that the patriarchs kept the Torah, followed the Torah, even though it wasn't given? Is because it says about Abraham that Abraham kept my voice. In other words, listen to my voice. In other words, follow the Torah, as Rashi points out, that he kept my charge, referring to the decrees to distance themselves from actions that the Torah warns against. For example, prohibitions to prevent illicit relationships. So what does it mean Avraham kept the Torah? Sorry, Avram hearkened to my voice, is that he followed the Torah even before these prohibitions were given on Mount Sinai. Or he followed them, but he made sure to set up preventions to set up preventions for it to even become a possibility. One thing that Judaism is very careful about and very clear about as well is that when it comes to immoral relationships or illicit relationships, there's a concept called einat petrupus la'arayis. There's no such thing as a guarantor against these types of relationships because as we know, it goes beyond human logic. The things that happen go beyond human logic. So therefore, we have to put in guardrails as part of Jewish law to prevent being even in a situation that somebody could fall into potentially doing something that they're not supposed to do. So that's why we're never alone. You're never supposed to be alone with someone in a room. In other words, alone with a locked door in a room with someone you're not supposed to have intimate relationships with. Not because you might do something, just because you don't put yourself in that situation. Physical contact is another one. Having any sort of social or friendly physical contact between someone you're not allowed to be intimate with is another important guardrail that we set up. And these are the things that Avram already put in practice even before the Torah was given. So now Rashi, Rashi just said was very simple, that Avram followed my voice and this is what he did. But there's certain things um, that Rashi doesn't address, specifically about this story, um, specifically about this story of Yaakov marrying two sisters. Because the first thing a 5-year-old will want to know is, it says earlier that Avram listened to my voice and Avram followed in my ways. And Rashi says that that Avram was careful not to violate any of the prohibitions, specifically relating to immorality. By the way, this is how we know it's not just a 5-year-old, but it's the 5-year-old within us. In other words, the intellect of a 5-year-old, the simplicity that we have. It doesn't make sense that Rashi wouldn't address the fact that Yaakov married two sisters. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to learn about the Noahide laws. What was the world? What honor system or what ethical system did the world follow before the Torah was given? So before the flood, there was a free for all. People would just do what they want. There was no ethics. There were no morals, and that's why it led to the world being destroyed. Hashem said the people are no longer, they're not responsible for their actions anymore. They can no longer exist. After the flood, Hashem gave Noah 6 commandments. That eventually it was 7, but first it was 6 commandments that every single human being is required to follow. And that this exists until today, by the way. So, for example, if let's say let's say Mashiach comes and and non-Jews want to live in Israel, which is fine, but they would have to follow these 6 commandments. What are they? These are very logical and very basic civil commandments that we're talking about here. Number 1, again, a prohibition against idol worship. You got to believe in one God, which includes blasphemy against God as well. Murder, incest and adultery, theft, as well as the commandment to establish courts of justice. This is the 6 commandments. How do we know about this? Because the Torah doesn't tell us about this. Though we have received these commandments separately from Moshe, we would have embraced them regardless because they are logical, and it still appears from the Torah that God instructed Adam concerning them. So these are commandments that the sages have taught us, that were given to Noach, even though these are all commandments that we should still keep and follow just from an ethical code. But because Hashem commanded us to follow these commandments, we are careful with them. This is regarding the entire humanity. God added another prohibition, a 7th one later, about not eating a piece of flesh from a living animal. In other words, you cannot cut off a limb of a living animal and eat it. There's a long explanation as far as why why this one specifically, but we won't talk about that right now. So these are what's called the 7 Noahide laws. The Rebbe campaigned very strongly that we should promote these laws. We should talk about them. When we say laws, we're talking about ethics. That number 1, there should be a civil society, established courts. Murder and sexual morality are very, very important. Theft. These are all things that are common morals and ethics, but to promote the values of them and to promote the fact that we follow them because God commanded us, not because it makes sense to us. So take theft, for example. Sometimes you could justify if you're stealing from a thief or stealing from someone who owes you money or stealing from someone who has it coming, so to say. So if it's your own logic that's deciding these ethics and morals, you could easily come to conclusions that will change it. Therefore, we establish that these are God-given commandments, and by being God-given, even if they're not logical, we still have to follow them. These are the established laws. This was a law during the times of Abraham and Yaakov as well. Now, so could it be that this is what Hashem was talking about, that Abraham followed in my ways? The problem with that is that everyone kept these. At the time of Abraham, people followed these laws, not the idol worship part, but everything else, they followed them. In fact, during the post-flood, the society was extremely careful with sexual immorality, specifically rape, because in their opinion, that's what caused the flood. So as a way to prevent the flood, people were very strict not to allow that kind of behavior or that kind of free-for-all from a civil society perspective. So everybody was doing that. So when it says that Avram kept my laws, it must be that we're talking about the laws of the Torah, that Avram was keeping them even though the Torah wasn't given yet. Let's take a look here at Rashi. Torah lived for many years after Terach. Terach, Avram's father, lived for many years after Avram left Haran. However, the Torah tells us that Terach passed away in the portion of Noach, before we even learn about Abraham's journey, yet he was still alive. The Torah, as we know, doesn't go in chronological order. So why does the Torah tell us that Terach passed away before we learn about Abraham's departure? So Rashi explains, so that the matter would not become public knowledge and people would not gossip that Avram failed to fulfill the requirement to honor one's father. As a way to ensure that we don't think that Avram didn't fulfill the mitzvah of honoring his father, the Torah tells us about Terach's passing. Even though Avram did honor, even though he left, but he still took care of his family, as we know from what we learned earlier, Avram, that his name represented the fact that he still was the leader and still was the sustainer of his homeland and especially his family. However, the Torah doesn't want you to think that Avram leaving was a disrespect to his father, even though his father was an idol worshiper. The Torah still wants us to know that Avram was careful with all of these mitzvahs. Similarly, here's where we learn that, and Rashi is telling us that during the days of Abraham after the flood, people were very, very strict about these laws of relationships, of rape, of all these things, because of the flood. The flood was specifically mentioned that it was because of the sexual morality, and therefore, as a way to protect the world, that was their climate change crisis. Is that if we want the world to exist, this is what we have to protect. We have to protect women. We have to protect society from this type of behavior, and this is something that everyone kept, which means that Avram obviously had to go above and beyond. So now, there's two types of laws. Okay, so let's take an example from a civil situation. There are certain civil responsibilities that we have as being a citizen, right? You have to obey the traffic laws. You have to obey the government restrictions, or you have to follow the law. You don't break the law. That's something that we all do. But then there's an idea of going above and beyond the law. What does that mean? Maybe volunteering or doing things for your community or for society that you're not required to do, but it's a good thing to do. So for example, let's say there's a law not to litter, right? So it's against the law to litter. However, if you see trash on the floor, do you have to pick it up? No. By law, you don't have to. Should you? Yes. So is it a binding law? No, but it's a going above and beyond type of thing where you still do something because it's the right thing to do ethically. So the binding laws at the time of Abraham and the other patriarchs were the 7 laws of Noach, which include the prohibition against relationships, as well as honoring parents. That was something they took on as a binding law. However, the patriarchs and the matriarchs adopted all of the Torah because they knew what the Torah was going to be. It just wasn't given in physical form yet. They adopted all the laws of the Torah, even though they were not legally obligated to do so. So they followed the Torah as if they were like picking up the trash kind of thing. In other words, they were going above the law, going above and beyond by following the laws of the Torah, even though they weren't required to do so. And the reason why they weren't required to do so was because the Torah, following the Torah, doing mitzvos, wasn't going to accomplish the same thing it accomplishes after Mount Sinai. After Mount Sinai, we have the ability to unite the spirituality and materialism, the godliness and physical, and reveal the godliness within the physical through every mitzvah that we do. When you take something and you use it for a mitzvah, or you elevate the skin of an animal for parchment, for a Torah, for a mezuzah, or for tefillin, or you light Shabbos candles with the wax and with the wick, you make that physical item holy. This wasn't possible before the giving of the Torah. So all of their actions were voluntary because they still couldn't accomplish what we could accomplish now after the giving of the Torah. So it was adopted in a voluntary way, including the prohibition not to marry two sisters, or at least so we think. So now, here we get to the question of when are you allowed to be lenient with Torah law, and when do you have to be strict with Torah law? So remember we talked earlier about setting those guardrails for situations that might lead to sexual immorality, where you don't put yourself in a situation. You don't wait till the point that you have to hold yourself back. You don't put yourself in a situation where you even have to hold yourself back, because that's part of the guardrails the Torah wants us to keep. So Torah is full, our Jewish life and Jewish practice and Jewish law is full of these guardrails, of things that we do to protect ourselves and to ensure that we have an environment that protects us from doing something we're really not supposed to do. However, when is there a situation that that the sages, we're not talking about rabbis, we're talking about the sages. Sages are the Mishnah of the Talmud, the ones that actually know the entire Torah inside out, or the sages from the Code of Jewish Law. When are they allowed to be lenient? So let me give you an example. Kosher, right? So today, keeping kosher means making sure that whatever you eat has been supervised to ensure that it's only kosher food. Obviously, produce doesn't count because you don't need to be, just produce is kosher. But if it's processed, even if it's something very simple, say honey, for example, right? So it's best to only buy honey with a kosher symbol on it because you know it's been supervised. Honey is kosher. Pick anything that's natural, that technically doesn't, contains all kosher ingredients. We still ensure that we have a kosher supervision and we have the kosher symbol before we buy it. However, speaking from a factual or from a logical perspective, there's plenty in the supermarket and plenty of processed foods that don't have a kosher symbol but are 100% kosher. Or there's plenty of things that technically you could eat or it, because the chances of it being kosher ingredients are pretty much an absolute. It's just that it wasn't supervised. So when does Jewish law allow us to take down those guardrails and do something that usually we don't do, such as eating something that doesn't have a kosher symbol? So I'm going to give you a very good example. Medicine. When a doctor tells you you have to take a certain medicine, does it have a kosher symbol? No. But if the doctor says you need to take it, even if it's a supplement or something, if the doctor says you need to take it, so we don't require that. Obviously, if you could get a kosher symbol, great, do that. But you don't have to because it's for medical purposes. And therefore, the sages are lenient with something that is required for your health. Now, even if it's not a life-threatening situation, but still it's required for your health. So therefore, you don't have to be as strict with the kosher symbols. Now, I'm not giving instructions for specific situations. Please talk to your rabbi when it comes to specific situations. I'm giving you an idea of that the situation sometimes drives how we set these guardrails or not. Why are we talking about this? Because when it comes to a situation where you have binding laws, which laws that you cannot break no matter what, versus optional commitments, what do you do when you have a dilemma or you have a contradiction between something that you've committed to, but you have another obligation that you've made to another person that will break this optional commitment that you've taken on, that will break this extra guardrail that you've taken on? What do you do? So when we're talking about like something that we've taken on ourselves, that we say, hey, listen, I'm going to take a resolution and I'm going to go to the gym every morning, right? and then somebody needs my help on one morning. So obviously, big deal. You're going to miss the gym one day. You go and you help your friend, or you go and help the person that needs help. But let's say it's an optional commitment that the sages have given us. So, like Pirkei Avot, which is called Midas Chassidus, which is going above and beyond the law, or some other sort of character trait or practice or restriction or something that you've taken on because the sages have recommended it. So it's not your own commitment. It's not your own, resolution. It's something the sages have given us. But it's still optional, or it's still an extra, or it's still a bonus. But you have to break that in order to help someone else. So I want to tell you a quick story. At the previous Rebbe's, Pesach, I don't think it was the Pesach Seder. Maybe it was the Pesach Seder. It was the Pesach meal, that's for sure. Now, in Chabad, as you know, we've taken on an extra stringency. We obviously cannot eat chametz. You cannot eat anything that is considered to be leavened bread or one of the 5 types of wheat mixed with liquid that has risen. That's considered chametz, right? We can't have that. And Pesach has specific things that are considered totally chametz. Then there are things that we go a little bit above and beyond, like kitnius, so that's alternative flours from like corn or other beans or rice. So we don't eat any of those because, at least from an Ashkenazic perspective, because we don't want to mix that up with, we don't want to confuse that with real flour or whatever. The point is that Passover has laws and restrictions that go above and beyond to protect us from violating the idea of eating chametz, which is a biblical command. Now, in Chabad, one restriction that we take, and it's not just Chabad, but Chabad is like, the champion of this one. One restriction that we take on is that we don't mix the matzah with liquid. Why? Because what if there's a piece of flour a kernel of flour that wasn't baked, so it's still raw flour, and you mix it with liquid, and then it could rise and become chametz. Now, the chances of that are very slim, but in Chabad, until the last day of Passover, we don't mix matzah with liquid. But it's a stringency. It's not halacha. It's not Jewish law. If you eat gebraks, if you eat matzah with liquid, you're not eating chametz. You're not violating Passover. It's an extra stringency that we follow. However, at this Pesach meal of the previous Rebbe, somebody was dipping their matzah in beet soup. And this is at the previous Rebbe's dinner table. I mean, it was a big deal. There was a lot of people there, but still, it's well known that Chabad doesn't do this. So people were making a big deal about it, and eventually the previous Rebbe overheard and asked what's going on. And they said this individual is mixing his matzah with liquid. And the previous Rebbe immediately hushed them up and said, better let the matzah become red, because it was beet soup, than making someone's face red. Leave him alone. He's not violating Passover. It's our stringency. God forbid to use our stringency to embarrass another person. We're not going to use our mishigas, I call it mishigas, but our way of going above and beyond to, God forbid, use that to hurt someone else's feelings. Another interesting story. This is with the great Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, another great Jewish sage from I think about 100 or 200 years ago. So he was once traveling with a caravan of people, and it came time to wash his hands for bread. And he took the minimum. If you don't have a lot, it's known in halacha, if you don't have a lot of water, you only have to wash your hands up until your knuckles. That's a thing that you could do if you don't have enough water, but at least your fingers have to be washed. So they had plenty of water on this trip. However, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter still washed his hands with the bare minimum amount, and literally the bare minimum amount, and that's what he, and then he went on to eat the bread. So some of his students asked him, the sages have taught us that you're supposed to wash your whole hand if you can, and not only that, but the amount of blessings that you'll bring by washing your hands fully and properly, using the water correctly. How could you not do that? So he said, I noticed that every time we stop, one of the I guess in those days, these big carriages, they used to have like people that were in charge. So there was a woman who was in charge of bringing the water off of the wagon onto the ground and whatever, and it was very, very heavy. And she had to keep on going to fill it up from the wherever water sources they were at. They would have to go fill it up, because I'm not going to make her have to get more water on my account of being extra stringent. I'm going to use the bare minimum that I need, because I don't want to have to inconvenience someone to have to work harder because I'm being more stringent in my religious practice. So why is this important? Because we're going to come back to Yaakov now. Yaakov had a dilemma. He promised Rachel to marry her, and as Hasidus tells us, Kabbalah teaches us from Kabbalah that Yaakov represented the energy of godliness, of connecting with the future Jewish nation. And Rachel represented the mother, in other words, the producer of all the Jewish nation spiritually. And what we call is Malchus, which means the communicator from the spiritual worlds into reality. So Yaakov was the energy, and Rachel was the one who was going to be the realist or the finalist, the one to actually bring it into reality. And this was a spiritual experience that was supposed to be happening in order for the Jewish nation to be born. So it wasn't just a physical act of getting married and producing children. So Yaakov had a problem. He has this obligation to marry Rachel, and he has the obligation to produce the Jewish nation, and yet he was tricked into marrying Leah. So now, according to civil law, according to the 7 Noahide laws, he was allowed to marry 2 sisters because that wasn't prohibited yet. According to his extra stringency, according to the fact that he kept the Torah, which was an optional extra at the time, was an optional extra stringency, he was not allowed to marry Rachel. So does he hold on to his extra religious beliefs, extra religious practice of going above and beyond the law to follow the Torah when it was still not yet needed, not yet required? Or does he fulfill his commitments that he made and not leave Rachel hanging high and dry? And what choice did he make? He chose to let go of his extra stringency in order to fulfill the commitments and of what he needed to do, especially because God was telling him that his job was to build the Jewish nation. So this was what was required of him. So he let go of his extra stringency. So the Rebbe explains a little bit better over here what we're talking about and what Yaakov did. So one of the norms adopted at the time was the nations would refrain from deception. That was another thing that we were careful about. This may be inferred from the fact that when Yaakov said to Lavan, "Why did you deceive me?" So this norm was accepted to the extent that even Lavan, the swindler, was compelled to defend himself with the argument that marrying a younger sister out of the older sister is not done in our society, in our place. So deception was considered to be something against the civil code, against the civil society, against the societal norms, which is why Lavan had to defend himself. Now, what would really happen here? So considering that Yaakov had previously promised Rachel that he would marry her, not keeping his pledge would have been deceptive. His personal choice to observe the non-binding stringency of the Torah, which wasn't given yet, of do not marry 2 sisters, could not overrule the prohibition against deception. So he had the mandatory, the compelling, the mandatory law that he had to follow, which was do not deceive. And then he had this optional stringency of do not marry 2 sisters of the Torah, which wasn't given yet, but was only his personal acceptance of it. So ultimately, what the Rebbe is teaching us from this Rashi is that Yaakov married 2 sisters because at the time, the prohibition against marrying sisters was a voluntary family practice, not yet a binding law. However, the law against deception was binding, and since he had promised to marry Rachel, he was obligated to fulfill that promise, even if it meant marrying 2 sisters. So what does this teach us? Putting aside the story of Yaakov, and obviously from a human perspective, especially a male perspective, the idea that you have to marry another woman doesn't seem that much of a sacrifice. But for Yaakov, I promise you, it probably was. I could guarantee you, it probably was. But putting all that aside, we all have our spiritual journey. We all have our spiritual pursuits that we have. Some of us less so, some of us more so, but we all have things that are important to us that we do. Sometimes we are extra careful with certain things, sometimes whatever it is. What the Rebbe is teaching us here is that that's all great. But when it comes to the needs of others, when it comes to what you're needed for, when it comes to the requirements that you've committed to or that your community needs of you, you cannot allow your stringencies or your extra practice. You can't allow that to prevent you from fulfilling your basic responsibilities as a human being, as a Jew, as a community member, whatever it is. You cannot allow those to prevent it. Now, to break Jewish law, that you can't do. To break the law, that of course not. But those extra things, the things that you've taken on, which are good, go for it, but not at the expense of someone else. So if you want to daven very loud, you want to daven the whole day, and you want to daven very loud, which is fine, beautiful. But if by doing that you're going to prevent or disturb someone else, then your extra stringency or your extra level of practice is at the cost or at the expense of someone else's ability to function, and therefore it's not coming from the right place. So all of our spiritual pursuits are great, but they can never override our accountability and our responsibility to each other. So some Jews know nothing of Judaism and require spiritual charity, someone to teach and show them the basics. In such circumstances, no one has the right to claim they can't because they don't have time. They should better study Torah and pray themselves. I can't teach Torah to someone else because I'm too busy studying Torah myself. Or I can't help somebody else during davening because I'm davening myself. That doesn't work. Because unless you're in the middle of a part of davening that you can't speak or whatever, your job is to help someone else. The fact that you see that other person who needs help means that God needs you to help that person. So put your stringency, put your extra motivation aside and focus on what you really need to do, which is helping the other person. Rather, we must judge ourselves. What makes our spiritual devotions more important or better than those of our fellow? What makes our davening better than theirs? What makes our Torah study better than theirs? Is it right for us to worship God at the highest level at the price of refusing other Jews their basic spiritual needs? This is just interesting. This is also a talk to those who would rather live in communities with abundance of Jewish resources and kosher food and schools and everything else, as opposed to going out and living in a community where you could actually make an impact on those who need it most, even at the expense of not having all those luxuries. So there's a story here of Reb Shimshon Stock. Shimshon Stock was a very Alav Shalom. He was a very special man who would do a lot of good work to help a lot of people. But he told the story that when he was a teenager, so I'll just read the story straight. It's a pretty interesting story. This is from the early 40s. I was a crazy kid. I was wild. At one point, my friend was serving the previous Rebbe, and I was sitting upstairs and rushing him to go serve the Rebbe faster. I said, hurry up, we have to go. So the Rebbe asked, what is your rush? The Rebbe, the current Rebbe, in other words, it was the previous Rebbe's son-in-law who overheard them, asked him, what are you rushing? Where are you going? I said, you don't want to know. He said, tell me. I won't tell anyone. I said, you don't want to know. I had just turned 15, and after he asked several times, I told him I did not have the nerve to tell him right away that I wanted to go to the movies. But since he said, tell me, I won't feel bad, I won't tell anyone, so I told him. I told the Rebbe that we're going to the movies. In those days, going to the movies was a interesting experience in the 40s, whatever that was. It wasn't bad, but it just was, not maybe the best use of time. So the Rebbe asked, and the Rebbe who was running 3 organizations at the time, he was in charge of all of the Chabad's outreach efforts, as well as the publishing house, as well as all the educational activities. The Rebbe was a very, very busy man. So the Rebbe asked, maybe instead of rushing to go to the movies, I'll learn with you Torah for a half hour from 8 to 8:30. Notice he didn't say let's learn for an hour. He just let's learn for a little bit. We went to learn with him every Thursday night for about 6 weeks. I was not studious. I was not interested in it. So we sat and discussed, and he would encourage me to be more observant. He would not rebuke me. Rather, he helped me understand that it would be better for me to be more observant. We studied the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the short version of the Kodesh Law. That much I recall, but we did not delve into it deeply. We learned certain laws, but we did not discuss them much. He focused more on my character traits. He did not lower my self-esteem. He did not push me down. He never pushed people down, especially me. I don't know why, but that was the Rebbe. He never pushed people down. So here you have the Rebbe who literally has the world on his shoulders, who overhears this boy going to the movie, and he knows that he could make a difference in this boy's life by studying Torah with him, which was a very big deal. That he would, at that point the Rebbe was considered to be already being groomed to be the next Rebbe, and for him to spend that amount of time, or to spend time with these young boys, shows the importance of never letting an opportunity to help someone else, never letting that opportunity go. So deep down, we always know what is right, what's the right thing to do. Often the best person to conduct for guidance is yourself. So there's another story. I'm going to tell the story verbally. But this story is one of my favorite. And it's about the Rabbi Weinrab. And he was from Maryland. And he once was going through a very difficult situation. And he called the Rebbe's secretary and he didn't say his name. He just said that there's I'm a Jew from Maryland, or a Jew from Maryland, and I need help. And the secretary asked the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, if you live in Maryland, you're fine. You don't need to talk to me. You could go. There's a Jew by the name of Weinreb that will be able to help you. So the secretary asked him, so you heard the Rebbe's answer. The Rebbe told you who you should go talk to, and he'll help you. However, the person himself was that Weinreb. So he said, I can't mind, that's who I am. So the Rebbe said, so then he heard the Rebbe answer, because the secretary would talk on the phone and the Rebbe was nearby. He heard the Rebbe answer that, I guess that means you have to look within yourself for the answer for the solution that you have. In other words, without even knowing who was on the phone, the Rebbe said, go to Weinreb, which was, underhandedly or subconsciously a message that sometimes we have the answer within ourselves. So we don't need to ask the question of when should I stop davening or when should I stop learning to go help someone else. We know the right thing to do. When someone needs us, we know when we're needed. We know what we're needed for. And God forbid to turn that down or to turn it away because of some, extra religious practice that we want to do that we feel is more important than helping someone else. So the Rebbe gives us a final word here that we must assess ourselves honestly. There's a saying from the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe of Shmuel Schneerson that you certainly can't mislead God, God forbid. You also can't mislead the entire world. You can only mislead yourself. So it is an achievement to mislead a fool. In other words, you're just talking about fooling yourself. Then what's the big deal? The fact that this saying was brought up to our attention means that we could live up to it. The Torah says it's not in the heavens. The Torah is down here or across the ocean. And Rashi explains if it were in the heavens, you would need to go climb after it to study it. If it were across the ocean, you would need to cross the ocean. But by Hashem's grace, it's not in the heavens. It's here where we are. It's with you. It's part of us. It's within us. And therefore, we're able to make that honest assessment to be able to help to make the right decision, which means helping someone who needs help, never not helping them at the expense of our own, or not helping them because we're too focused or too involved with our own spiritual matters. I want to finish with a quick story. The second Chabad Rabbi Dov Ber, so before he became Rabbi, he was known to be a extremely deep intellectual thinker. In other words, his discourse, Hasidic discourses, are the hardest ones to study because they're so deep and so complex and so layered. So whenever he was studying, he would totally get lost in his studies, and he would never notice anything around him. It was actually joked about him that if you could cut off his finger, blood wouldn't come out, but words of Chassidus would come out, words of Torah. So one time he was studying, and he had his baby carriage. One of his children were in the carriage, and he was rocking the carriage as he was studying. But he was so engrossed in the studying that he didn't even realize what he was doing, and his baby was crying. And he didn't hear it. He was focused on his studies. And his father, the Alter Rebbe, the Shneur Zalman, hears the baby crying. He comes downstairs, and he sees his son, rocking over a book, studying, and his baby is crying. So he immediately takes out the child and holds the child and comforts the child, and he nudges his son out of his stupor, and he says, "You can never be so engrossed in your studies that you don't hear the cry of a child." In other words, we can never lose ourselves in our spiritual pursuits that we don't hear the cry of someone else who needs our help. We always have to make sure that we are there for them and we are there for those who need us, and never at the expense of our own spiritual pursuits. So I'll put up the key points over here. We don't have to read them, but ultimately we have to make those decisions and make sure that we're doing what we need to do to fulfill our mission, fulfill our purpose, and it's always good to have those goals in mind and those spiritual growth in mind, but it can never come at the expense of another person's needs. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, of course, you could unmute yourself.